Welcome to Crazy Enough to Win. I'm your host, John Grubbs. Welcome to the show. This is a podcast about going big. It is about, being crazy enough to try things, to do things, to attempt things that average mere mortals are afraid to attempt. We have a special guest on today's podcast, Andy Miller with Big Swift Kick. He is a speaker, he is a trainer, he is a sales expert. Andy, welcome to the show.
John, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. And you and I have had to work through a few kinks in order to get this podcast to happen. And I really appreciate you taking your precious time to be on this show. How long have you been helping companies improve sales?
Oh, Lord, I've lost track of time, but I think it's coming up on 28 years.
28 years. So I'm guessing you didn't have all that gray hair when you started in this business.
I'm just happy to have hair, let alone gray. No, I did not. I call myself kind of the accidental consultant because I started a software company in Europe, discovered nobody around the world could sell the way I wanted them to, ended up teaching them how to do it, and thought, if I ever sell this thing, I'd love to go into sales training and consulting because I enjoyed it. And that's kind of how I started the journey. We sold the company, and that's what happened.
Wow. So listeners, Andy spoke to one of the groups that I have the fortunate opportunity to lead, and we were talking about pandemic haircuts. Andy told us that his hair is a little longer than he normally likes it. And Andy, I went through a period with longer hair than I've worn in years, and even grew a beard the whole month of April. I didn't shave the whole month of April. Is there a haircut in your future?
I just got one 2 weeks ago, but I still look like a chia pet. I just scheduled another one for tomorrow. But when you think about the long hair, back in my teenage days, I had it down to the middle of my back. So I'll never go there again. At least, hopefully not. But yeah, it's a mess. It's a lot to take.
I have a 17-year-old. He's going through the long hair phase. His hair is almost down to the middle of his back, and he's a pitcher on his high school summer baseball league. And my wife got a picture of him pitching last night, and the hair is swirling around his face as he's releasing the ball. And I said, "That's a great picture. You got to let me have it." But she's not a fan of the long hair. She's hoping that he will cut his hair.
Yes.
But I think not all of us, but many of us went through a long hair phase at some point in our lives. I had the mullet in the 80s.
Right? Tattoos, piercings, long hair, something. It's just a rite of passage as a teenager.
So you got some tattoos that we need to know about?
No, no tattoos, no piercings. I just stopped at the long hair piece.
Okay.
But I do have a suggestion. If you don't want your kids to do it, you need to do it before they do, because once you do it, it's not cool.
Oh.
So mom and dads, if you're afraid your kids are going to get a piercing, go get it before they do and show it to them and just totally gross them out.
That's hilarious. I was in the Army for 3.5 years during the first Gulf War, and I almost got a tattoo several times on nights that I will not mention here, but I never did. And my boys said, "Dad, why don't you have a tattoo?" And I said, I think I don't have anything against a tattoo, but I never found something that I really wanted on me permanently. I haven't found the right tattoo, I would guess.
Yeah.
What's your philosophy towards?
I've got that Northern European skin, so I'm pretty marked up anyhow without any tattoos. So I've kind of got the natural thing going on.
How funny. So speaking of that, we have listeners around the world. Tell us about where you live.
So I live in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm about 10 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. But I born in Ohio, grew up around Chicago, spent a year in Guatemala building houses for earthquake victims, lived in Amsterdam for 3 years and had offices and places all over the world. So I feel like I'm more a citizen of the world versus a guy who lives in Alexandria.
Wow. Amsterdam for 3 years. That had to be an interesting experience.
That was a fun time. I can tell you that. That was a fun time. But I was gone half of the time. So, when you're building a business, and at that time the EU had not been formed, so you go to bed at night, you'd write down, what country am I in, what language am I supposed to speak, what day is it, kind of thing, because it all just became a blur. But it was an intense 3 years. As you said, don't go average, don't go mediocre, go big. That was my 3 years of just going big, and it's blood, sweat, and tears to make it happen. But you know what? It was a fun time.
Wow. How old were you when you lived in Amsterdam?
28, I think.
Wow. Yeah, I've never been to Amsterdam. I hear there's a lot of distractions for a young person in Amsterdam. Is that true?
Uh, can be, depending on how disciplined you are. That a lot of people go to Amsterdam for the holidays to party.
Yeah.
But when you're building a business, party is way down on your list. You don't. That's if you're gonna go big, you're not out wasting your time and your energy
Yeah.
partying your brains out. So
Sounds like you had different priorities at that
I
time
did.
in your life.
I did.
So whoever they is, they say us males mentally mature at age 27. Would you agree with that?
I think it's more like 40.
Yeah, I think my wife would debate on whether or not I've matured mentally yet, and I'm just past 50. So,
Yeah, and I'm 62, and I'm kind of when do you really get to know who you are? Who you are, what you're made of. You go out and you do adventurous stuff, and I've got 5 nieces, and I watched the dating that they went through in high school, and I'm thinking to myself, these are decent girls, and the guys they date are just idiots. But then I realized all high school guys are idiots, and I was one too. So I go, okay, at what point do you get out of that idiot phase? And I think girls tend to get there about 10 years before guys do. Is a gross generalization, but I still see guys in their late 20s doing a lot of idiot things. I don't know if you know who Larry Wingett is, but he's a guy who mentored me in speaking, and he wrote a number of books with kind of pithy titles. One of them is called "People Are Idiots and I Can Prove It," and you just open up your eyes and you just see it over and over again, going, "Yeah, I guess he kind of had a point." But I don't personally, I don't think a guy should get married before he's 30, because I don't think he knows who he is.
Wow. I'd like to meet that guy. My first leadership book was titled Leadership Among Idiots, Survival Guide for the Rest of Us.
Wow. Okay, there we go.
So there's a lot about idiocy in that book, and it's a humorous anecdotal look at leadership through the lens of servant leadership, actually. So interesting. Age 30. Age 30. I think there's some credibility to that. I've got a 24-year-old, and he's dating, and I think he's still trying to figure out what he wants to be when he grows up.
He tell his girlfriend, if she wants to scare him off, just bring up the question, would you ever like to get married?
He's got a yeah.
That'll throw the fear of God into him.
Yeah, I'm not going there. I'm going to leave.
Have a new girlfriend with he'll be rid of that one within a day or two.
Oh my gosh. So Alexandria, Virginia, how has COVID-19 changed that community?
It's really interesting because my wife and I both went on the cautious side of self-isolation. When COVID broke out, I had just gotten back from speaking at a conference in Orlando. We have a neighbor on one side who at that time was pregnant. She'd been trying to get pregnant for years, had a lot of difficulties. We have a neighbor on the other side who's in his late 70s, been in and out of the hospital lately. And I just said to my wife, I said, if we're going to help our neighbors, we have to self-isolate, because if we get them sick and one loses the baby or the other one gets sick and die because of we were asymptomatic, I said I would feel horrible about it. So we agreed to self-isolate, but I think most of this area has has chosen to do that too. I don't think it was I don't think it was political reasons. It was just, we'd rather be safe than sorry. So you err on the side of caution, and then you give it 2 or 3 weeks and see how does everything play out. The restaurants are open. Northern Virginia opened up a couple weeks later than the rest of the state. And right now we seem to be better off than most of the state, but I see pretty good compliance on people wearing masks, pretty good compliance on social distancing. And I don't know why this area is better at it than maybe the others have been. I don't know if it's political reasons, education, or just self-preservation, but we seem to be doing okay. So I'll keep my fingers crossed. It was interesting because I was looking at the Spanish flu in 1918, I think it was. And, I was born in 1958, and I don't remember people wearing masks everywhere I was. So something happened that said, it's okay not to wear a mask anymore, right? So I thought, well, let's just look up the history and what does history teach us? So it's pretty fascinating because during the Spanish flu, by law, you had to wear a mask, but wear a mask outside. People did not wear masks inside.
Wow.
So they did kind of that opposite of what you should have done. I don't know where that conventional wisdom came into play, but people wore it outside. They didn't wear it inside. I think something like, and you can't quote me on this, but something like 20 million people died worldwide. A million Americans died. And then I wanted to know, how long did this last? And it lasted for a year, mostly because by that time, everybody either became immune or had died off from it. So that whole herd immunity kind of thing, I'm a little nervous right now as I look at what's happening to the rest of the states. I don't think it was intentional to go herd immunity, but by our ignoring things or whatever circumstances have caused us to be where we are, we're probably heading towards the herd immunity resolution.
Well, even that word has become politicized, herd immunity. And I've been following and podcasting about Sweden since early March and following them, because I'm a data junkie. I like to look at numbers and statistics. And the hardest thing that I do right now is try to pull the politics out of the data because it's so politicized. Even this morning, I'm going to do a podcast. I read an article about the BBC, and because of the polarization of the media in the United States, I'm tending to get a lot of my data from external sources. I'm not saying that the BBC isn't political as well, but I'm trusting more in the validity of information I get from non-election year media outlets. So they said that they're based on some studies in Sweden, and I'll like I said, I'll podcast about this later. There seems to be a lot more immunity in the community than we realize, that there's a lot more people who are immune, in so much as they're not going to get nearly as sick as those who die from the virus, and that they may not even be able to transmit the disease because of their immunity. So I'll share something about that later. But here's a more, I guess, deeper, thoughtful question. 43% of all COVID deaths are from nursing homes. How do you see people adjusting and living with this virus going forward? Because I agree with you, it's going to last probably a year. And I don't think that we're going to be able to just hide from the virus much longer. How do you think we will adjust and live with it?
That's a really good question. My wife lost her mother a year ago, and I said to her, I'm kind of glad your mom's not around for this, because you would want to go see her, and they would see each other every day, and she would be isolated. And you have that conundrum, right? Of I want to go see my loved one, but in going to see my loved one, you put him or her at risk. And you hear family reunions where people got together and then they, grandpa got sick from COVID and died. And, I just don't know how you just deal with the mental game that plays with you. So, when this all started happening, I thought to myself, you're going to see the best of people and you're going to see the worst of people.
Mm.
You're going to see who's thoughtful and considerate and is going to be a team player and is going to do things because it keeps everybody safe. And then you're going to see those who are selfish and aren't going to be a good team player, and they're just going to do what they want to do and let the consequences happen however they are. And at that time, we didn't have enough data on it, and I still don't think we understand it enough yet. But I thought, now's the time when you find out what people are really made of. What's the expression? Something about, what do you do when nobody's looking?
Integrity.
And I think, I think it's kind of along that lines of, what do you do when the things that you do will have an impact on others? That it speaks to your character. I really think it speaks to your character.
Yeah. So we are, we're at a tough time because of not only the election year that's going on, but because everything seems to be politicized. How do we deal with the dichotomy of telling young people that they need to be more careful? Because my two boys are no longer social distancing. My youngest one's playing baseball, and baseball is just like it was last year. Us parents in the stands are trying to be a little bit socially distant, but the players aren't. My oldest son lives in Houston, which is a hot spot, and he came up with a girlfriend to visit this past weekend, and we opted not to go to church on Sunday because I asked him, I said, on your way up here, I said, have you been careful with this? Do you think it's safe for you to go into our church and expose some of the elderly people who are very vulnerable? And he said, no, Dad, I don't think that's a good idea. So we opted to do church online and not expose people. So how do you tell young people that they need to be responsible when we've got a media that's playing up the protests and all of the mass gatherings? How do you deal with that dichotomy?
Yeah, that's interesting because I just had this conversation this morning, and it was interesting because this was with a couple of guys who were talking along the lines of politics and COVID.
Yeah. And
they're like, well, the protesters aren't having this. And I think I saw this on the news last night too. The protesters aren't having this. And yet they're saying, you need to do this at rallies. And I said, guys, no, politics aside, the things I'm hearing is, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I'm going to take it more metaphorically than literally. They said your odds of getting it inside is 19 to 20 times more likely than outside. So I'm going, okay, if you're outside and you're doing a protest, should you wear a mask? Should you social distance? In my opinion, you should. But if you're inside and you're in a rally, that you don't have the fresh air to take things away. I think you should be socially distancing and wearing a mask then too, but you're inside and you're projecting, but there's no fresh air to come take it away. So, I think it's I don't mean this to sound cruel or funny, but it's natural selection. I mean, it's natural selection going, okay, you want to follow the guidelines? I think that's a good idea. You don't want to follow the guidelines? You can suffer the consequences. And you kind of go through and go, okay, so let's say this thing is highly contagious and consequences are very high for certain people. Well, let's pretend that's what it is. If you follow the guidelines, you minimize that, right? Let's pretend it's not nearly as bad or as contagious as everybody says, and you follow the guidelines. You're still going to be okay. So you kind of look at it and go, okay. Yeah. There's a formula that a friend of mine uses that works for NASA, and he says risk is probability times consequence. And I thought, what a great formula. What is the risk? What's the probability? What's the consequence? So probability low, but consequence is high, or probability is high, but consequence is low. So, you figure it out. But personally, I like to live. So I'm choosing mask and distancing. And, my wife is very social. I am too, but she's more than I am. And she's like, well, let's go out to a restaurant. I said, I'll go to a restaurant if we're outside. I will not go to a restaurant if we're
Mm.
inside. So
Yeah.
anything inside, I'm not going to the gym. I'm not going to church. I'm not going to a restaurant. Anywhere else where there's a crowd and we're inside, I'm not doing it right now. I'm going to wait a couple more weeks and see what does the data show me.
Mm. Well, that's interesting. We went to Walmart this past weekend to get some gardening stuff, and um, she said, "Are you going to wear a mask?" I said, "Yeah, I'll take my mask." But I went in there, and there was hardly anybody in the area where I was, so I didn't put mine on. She wore hers, but if it
Right.
would have been crowded, and if I thought it was, me putting someone else at risk or myself, I would have worn one. I've got no philosophical skin in the game for the mask.
Yeah, me
Even
neither.
though we keep getting contradictory information, the World Health Organization said 2 weeks ago, don't wear a mask unless you're treating a COVID-19 patient, which is
Yeah,
uh, it's just crazy. Let me pivot just a little bit. We're going to stay on that
sure.
topic, but this is a little pivot.
Okay.
If we get rid of sheepdogs, wolves will return. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on this defund the police movement that's going on?
Um, I think it's a misnomer. So I used to be my first job out of college, I was a special ed teacher. And then when I went back to school, I put myself through school. I was a prison guard. Not too many people know that. I never actually
Wow.
talk about that experience. But and to be technical, I was a detention center guard. So it's where they would hold them for weeks or whatever until they went to court and the final decision was made. But um, when I hear defund the police, I don't hear that literally. I hear it as, are there better ways of using the funds to make society better? I actually hear it as shift the funding. Um, now, are there things that could be done? Yeah, I mean, in some police departments, you don't have to have a college degree. I've got a friend that actually trains the police department out in Denver, and he teaches them on how to deal with things like, I don't know if you saw this. I think it was 2 years ago. There was an adult. He was autistic, and he was in the middle of the road. And I don't remember. He had something in his hands. I don't remember what it was. And they ended up shooting him because what you learn is you always check the hands. You don't know if they have a weapon in their hands or not. That's why they always say, show me your hands on the car, hands up. But the first thing from a safety perspective for a police officer is show me your hands, because that's I want to know if you've got a weapon or not. So the police have not been trained for the most part in dealing with mental health, and I I don't know if that's their responsibility or not. But who do you call when trouble happens? You dial 911 and the police show up. So there needs to be at least some kind of training or triage of how do we handle this? Who do we need to bring in? So yeah, I think the defund, if they literally mean defund the police, that's bullshit. I hope I can say that on your podcast,
You
because
can.
who's going to come bail them out when they really need the help, right?
Yeah.
So you need law enforcement. Do we need to update law enforcement, change with the times? I'm sure some yes, some no, but I'm not an authority on police departments, so this is just my opinion. But is it time to reevaluate and say what things do we need to do to be more effective? I think that's a fair statement.
Hmm. I think it goes full circle to what you said earlier about this mental maturity, especially in us guys. I can't speak for the ladies out there about this 30-year-old getting married, maturity. I heard someone say something yesterday I thought was really interesting. I don't think they've thought this movement through, if they mean it literally, defund the police, which is the way I'm taking it in places like Minneapolis. Um,
Yeah,
if 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 heaven forbid there's a school shooting or a school hostage situation, who are they going to call? Who's going to go in there
yeah,
and approach someone who's armed on behalf of those children? Who's trained to do that? So I don't think
yeah,
some of these people that are calling for defund the police have really thought this through. I think it's I think it's a very myopic view, and I personally think that that's not really the issue. I think the issue is more political. But yeah, I think the
Yeah.
challenge we face is people need someone to protect them in difficult times. And if we don't have sheepdogs out there, and I love the sheepdog analogy, um, that
Yeah.
there are people that have that instinct in them to protect and to serve. And there are bad people in every occupation. There's bad doctors, there's bad lawyers, there's going to be bad. Everyone in any type of occupation is going to be exposed to someone who is not ideal for that role. But to
Yeah.
wholesale throw them all out because of the actions of some people who are corrupt is, I think, a false message. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree 100%. I think it's a few bad apples who ruin it for all the rest. Listen, these folks, the men and women who are police officers and troopers and sheriffs, they put their life on the line.
Mm.
And it's fascinating because this was about 3 months ago. I was taking my wife to the doctor. We were late for her regular appointment. Um, she didn't know exactly where it was. I went past the building. She goes, "Oh, wait, that was it." So I looked in my mirror. I didn't see any cars. I did an illegal U-turn. And of course, there was a cop around to see that. And I pulled into the building. I pulled into a parking spot, and he got out of his car and he said, "Why did you pull into a parking spot?" And I said, "I did it to keep you safe." And he goes, "That's funny. You're the second person who said that today." And I said, "Is that the wrong thing to do?" And he said, "It is." He said, "You're better to pull off on the side of the road. And the reason is we call for backup. And when we're in a parking lot, we're harder to find."
Mm.
And I said, "I didn't know that." I said, when you watch these horrific police videos on TV, they show you're pulled over on the side of the road. The officer's getting out of his or her car. They walk over to license and registration, please. And some fool comes by because they're not paying attention. They're texting or they're drunk, and they hit the police officer.
Mm.
So from my perspective, I thought I was doing something to keep him safer. From his perspective, he thought I was getting ready to dump the car and run.
Oh.
So it's very interesting, right, that you got these different perspectives, and yet that's not being communicated. Now, thank God, he asked me and I explained, and then we got to have a dialogue about it. So in the future, I know if I get pulled over, I shouldn't be thinking about it in terms of I'm worried about him getting hit. I need to think about it in terms of I need to pull over in a place that makes it easy for backup to find him and support him.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and I think you're right. A lot of us aren't educated about police safety, and I think the last time I got pulled over, it's been a few years. Um, I hadn't been pulled over in so long. I got out of my truck and started walking back toward the police officer, and he says, "No,
Yeah,
get back in your vehicle." I
yeah,
said, "Oh, okay. I was just trying to make it easy on you. I got my license." He said, "No, get back in the vehicle." I'm like, "Okay." So yeah, well, I don't think we know how to interact with the police officers. Something interesting. A business friend of mine said something that I thought was interesting, and we're going to get to your business in a moment. So
that's fine.
um, he his son plays football for SMU, Southern Methodist University,
Okay,
and his son's trainer is a 35-year-old uh, African American from sub-Saharan Africa. So he's really dark skinned. I mean, he
okay,
is really, really dark skinned. And he said he moved here to the United States to go to college, studied and became a physical trainer.
okay.
And that in the 15 years he's been in the United States, this floored me to hear this, Andy. I just couldn't believe it. In the 15 years he's been here in the United States, he's had a gun pulled on him by a police officer 5 times in 15 years. Can you believe
Wow,
that?
wow. I can actually,
It
but
just floored me. I don't ever think about being worried when I get pulled over, but my African American friends have told me that, especially if they have sons, they have to have the talk with their sons about the police.
yes,
And I did an article. I don't know if you're getting my articles, but I did an article and a podcast about should we spank our children, and I talk about growing up in a corporal environment, in a corporal environment reality, and I share some funny anecdotal stories. Uh, but I think that we have two lines that are converging right now that are causing a lot of the problems. Many young people are being raised in an environment where that's not popular anymore, and there's no. The thing we got out of corporal punishment is we feared and respected authority. I
Yes.
make I make the joke in the podcast, if I would have ever said some of the things that I hear young people say to their mother in front of my dad, I would have had a backhand fist in my face immediately.
Absolutely.
Immediately. It wouldn't have been, there would be no hesitation, no thought. So I grew up, you respect your mother. You certainly don't use the F word around your mother.
That's right.
Do you think we're seeing some of that play itself out in society? That's kind of that, and the fact that we don't understand some of those police rituals or safety guidelines, and then we have youth that are not being raised the same way. Do you think there's some overlap there?
I do. I I think we've done our youth a disservice, and the disservice is we're trying to make lives better for our kids, but we misinterpret making life easier as
Mm,
better.
love that.
And the challenge is adversity builds character. Adversity builds. We're kind of going back to don't get married before you're 30 because you don't know yourself. You need adversity to discover who you are and what you're made out of,
Yeah.
right? And and so I think about my grandparents who grew up in the Depression, and then they didn't want it to be as hard on my parents, so they made their lives a little easier. And then my parents, want to be so we make it easier, and by removing those obstacles, we misinterpret easier as better.
Yeah.
And I disagree with that. I mean, it's just paper routes and having to deliver in snow and ice and hurricanes and tornadoes or whatever. Well, you know, very few people get the paper anymore, and if they do, it's delivered by a guy in a van or a station wagon. I guess no station wagons anymore, but an SUV. And now it's all electronic, or mowing the grass. Right? You were, as a kid, you went out and mowed grass. So a lot of those things have kind of gone away. Um, but in terms of the racial perspective, yeah, I've talked to a number of my African American friends, and they one is a Vistage speaker, a well-known, super nice guy, and he said, Andy, he said, I'll tell you, I was driving from one Vistage talk to another, had a rental car, wearing a blue suit, red tie, white shirt, had the IBM look. I stopped at a 7-Eleven to get a Slurpee. I came out, and there were 4 cop cars surrounding me, all with their guns drawn. And they're like, put your hands up on the car. And he's like, okay, but why are you stopping me? And they said, you fit the description of somebody who broke into a house in the area. And he goes, your burglars wear blue suits with white shirts and red ties and drive rental cars? But so somebody had called,
Yeah.
intimidated by a black man driving near them. And the cop showed up, and I'm going, okay, I don't ever recall any of my friends saying they got pulled over while driving white.
Yeah.
Now, when I was in high school and I had long hair, I did get pulled over for driving hippie.
Yeah.
And a number of my African American friends have said they've gotten pulled over and they're convinced simply it was because they were black. And you know what? I think for whatever reason, and I've not pondered the reasons behind it, but somebody is seen as African American, and they are definitely seen differently than a white person. But we also have a lot of Hispanic friends, and they tell similar stories. And I have a number of Asian friends, and they talk about a bias or a prejudice. And having lived all over the world, I'm reluctant to say this, but I will. In every country that I've ever been, there's one group that has a prejudice or a hate for another group. It might be based upon race, It might be based upon what culture they're from. It might be based upon religion. Think about it. Up until Kennedy was elected, it was thought that a Catholic could never become president.
Yeah.
So there was bias against Catholics. So this is not to demean or take away from Black Lives Matter. I think we've got a lot of work to do in this country, and I think it'll be an ongoing effort as long as man is alive.
Yeah. I agree. And this is what I believe. It's a problem that's been around as long as humans have been around, and it's not a problem that's going to be solved. It's just a problem that's going to get better, and that's the optimist in me. That my boys up until this. Now we live in a small community in rural East Texas. I would say that the high school that my son goes to is probably 50% African American, 50% white, mixed with Hispanic. We don't have a lot of Hispanics, but a few, more than I did when I was growing up. But my boys they've pretty much been colorblind. I mean, the kids that come over to my house, it's a mix. It's always been a mix. So I hate this for them to be reminded of the ugly side of humanity that they weren't really, that they had not really seen. And it doesn't mean that it's not good for them in some ways to see some of this prejudice that's out there, but it's almost like it steals their innocence from what they had experienced. So it's almost like it was almost going away, and then it's all come back in our community.
Yeah, it's for some reason the genie's out of the bottle. I was thinking about this. So my grandfather on my mother's side was a very racist guy, but I never knew that because he never expressed it. Now, I don't know if my mother said to him, "You will not say this when the kids are around." My mother did not have that in her. Growing up in Chicago, we lived up in a mixed neighborhood.
Yeah.
A lot of my friends were not Caucasians, and I just never thought a thing about it. But after my grandfather died and I found out some of the things that he had been involved in, I was stunned.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm thankful for is that for whatever reason, he kept it to himself. And I think there's something about, okay, you have your thoughts for whatever reasons. Keeping the negative thoughts to yourself is actually doing everybody a favor.
Yeah.
It's when you start to express it and spread it, and you spread that to your kids or other people's kids, that this thing just perpetuates and gets out of hand. So, I'm kind of thankful that for whatever reason, my grandfather kept it to himself. I'm glad he did, because that's just not something I want in my life.
Well, thank you for being so deep philosophically with us. I think it's important for us to talk about these things, and listeners around the world, it gives them a perspective on what we are really like here in the United States, rather than what they see on TV, that we are deeper than what you see on the news. We're not all this or all that. We're more, I think, more meaningful than what the media portrays us to be, both in Virginia and in Texas. But we need to talk about business a little bit. You are in the sales training business. What is an ideal client like for you?
For me, and I only speak for myself, it's a middle market size company. So they're somewhere between 20 million to 500 million, sweet spot. They might be up to $1 billion. They're privately owned. They might be involved with private equity. The founder is still actively involved in the business, and they're looking at how do they accelerate growth. There's a lot of companies that do sales training, and to me, that's sales training per se is we check off the box because we did some training. I think of myself more as a sales consultant because I'm about moving the needle. Training might be a part of that. Usually it's kind of bottom of the list because there's so many other things that they can do. But I prefer to get paid on the performance, which makes me very unique compared to other folks that are out there, because I just don't know anybody else in sales consulting and training that gets paid on the performance or commission on the results.
I like that. I like that. So what are the most common challenges facing businesses when it comes to sales or business development?
There's a number of them. The two most blatant ones is they don't have a sales process, or they don't have an effective sales process. They may think they have one, but it's not effective, or nobody's following it. But usually they just don't have one, or the one they have is the wrong one. And then the second one is leadership. And I'm going to say specifically sales leadership. Sales leadership not doing the things that they need to do, or not knowing what to do. I mean, you can't go to school and get a degree in sales management. There's very little training out there. On the smaller companies, the owners tend to be the sales managers, and they're bad at it because they're wearing 5, 6, 7 different hats. So let's just say they're wearing 5. You can't be a sales manager 20% of the time and be effective at it. So those are the two big things. And I guess the third one I would say is just the lack of people's commitment to be professional at selling. What I like about selling is you always have to be, if you want to be a true professional, you always have to be improving. You've got to read books on business. You've got to read books specifically on your industry. I know you've got some members that are in oil and gas, and I do a lot in oil and gas. So, you need to know if you're selling to fracking or fluids or completion or pumps or compression. You need to know that language too. So you need to know the industry. You need knowledge on the specifics of what you're selling, but you also need to be good at psychology. You need to be good at asking questions, understanding people's motivation. You need good listening skills. You need to be innovative or creative. Somebody has a need, but they can't quite afford or work with you the way that you're structured now. How do you rework that so it's a win-win for everybody? And I sorry to use that term because I feel like it's overused, but how do you do this so it's in everybody's best interest?
Yeah.
But to be effective in sales, you constantly have to be improving. And one of the things about just on the human relation side, if you're getting better at that with you and your prospects and your clients, you're also getting better at that in your life. So
I like that.
Am I a better listener with my wife? Am I a better understander with my wife? Am I looking for ways to get an outcome that's beneficial to both of us? Absolutely. So family, friends, I'm going to tie it back to the Black Lives Matter and the protests and all those things right now. You actually learn de-escalation skills. So you get into a tense situation, how do you listen, feed that back to them, and then how do you de-escalate it instead of escalating it and making it worse? Those are all skills you learn in sales.
I know, and I love that. I love that so much because I think maybe it was Zig Ziglar that said it, that the best salespeople are really good at listening, and there are techniques. We've got a funny anecdote for you. Two of the leaders I'm working with now have, I guess, come to the realization that they promoted a really good salesperson into a really poor or mediocre sales manager. Do you see that a lot?
All the time. Why do I take my number one chef and turn him or her into the restaurant owner?
Yeah.
I mean, this was talked about in Michael Gerber's E-Myth.
Yep.
Because you think you're good at doing the job, makes you think that you're going to be good at the owner. But that's the number one mistake. I see it all the time. They take their number one rep. I mean, think about the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan at his peak. Why would you pull him out of the game and go, okay, we're now going to make you the coach. You're not going to play anymore.
It makes no sense.
No, it doesn't. But for some reason, everybody sees that, and it's a fallacy, but everybody sees that as a promotion.
Wow.
And it's not. And here's the kicker in it. So the salesperson gets promoted to sales management. He or she discovers they don't like being a sales manager. They work more hours, they make less money, they have less fun. And then they don't want to go back to the owner or the CEO and say, yeah, I made a mistake. What they do instead is they look for a job in sales and then they leave the company.
Yeah.
So it's a double whammy.
Yeah. It's the dirty little secret, right? Being promoted
It
into
is.
management and you realize I don't really like the job anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
They secretly wish to be fired or they'll quit so they can go back to what they enjoy doing again.
Yeah. That's why I don't think you should make anybody a sales manager until they're 30.
That's funny.
Just kidding. Just
Right?
kidding.
Life begins at 30.
Life begins at 30.
We're
All the
still,
rest up until then is just playtime and self-discovery.
we're not grown up until we're 30 years old.
Exactly. I don't think they even know how to shave until then.
That's an Andy Millerism. How funny. So let's talk about Virginia a little bit. I'm a bit of a foodie, and I love food. I love to cook. I would never make it my job. I've had the temporary seizure of thinking I wanted to own a restaurant at some time in my life, and I quickly get through that seizure and it goes away.
Good.
But what's the food scene like in Virginia?
Well, being 10 minutes from DC, we typically, the really good restaurants are there. And, the one you may be familiar with, Jose Andres, World Kitchen. So he's got world famous restaurants, all over the world. He does a lot for charity, and his restaurants are really fantastic. They're premium, but the food is fantastic. The experience is fantastic. The staff that he hires are phenomenal. So it's a whole experience. What kind
of food is it?
He's got a bunch of different ethnic kind of restaurants. But the recurring theme has a little bit of a nouveau spin on it.
So for us neophytes, what does a nouveau spin mean?
So it's kind of trendy, decorative. It's as much about the presentation as it is the dish. So it's the art of presentation meets Master Chef.
Yeah. Well, we're in Texas and bigger is better. And I'm going to tell you, tiny food does not work in Texas. We don't, some of these restaurants, I see the tiny food. I said that crap would go over like a lead balloon in Texas.
That is part of, whenever I see the term kind of nouveau as the description of the restaurant, I know that means smaller proportions.
You
nailed it.
Eight
Johnny
courses of tiny food,
I personally, give me a big old fajita and a margarita, and I'm happy.
You could exist well in Texas, my friend. My wife and I, we pretty much locked down for about, March, April, probably 2.5 months. But a couple that we're close to and another couple invited us to dinner, and there's a steakhouse that's pretty close to where we live. And it was a Saturday night. We had a reservation early at 6. And Andy, we got there and there was no social distancing in that steakhouse. I mean, it was like business as usual. But the steak was amazing. And I told my wife it was worth every bit of the risk that we endured to get that good steak and baked potato.
Nice.
So let's talk about how people can find you. If we've got a listener that's let's say in Europe or Australia, and they're needing some help with sales, or they've made the fatal error of promoting a really good salesperson, a sales manager, and they're like, what the hell do I do now? What do I do with this? How can people find you?
Well, so all they need to do is go to my website, or they can email me. But the website is bigswiftkick.com, just like your daddy used to give you. It was either the backhand or the kick in the butt, right?
Yeah.
So that's bigswiftkick.com, or send an email to amiller@bigswiftkick.com. But if somebody has some challenges, I'd be more than happy to talk with them about it and see if we can help them out.
bigswiftkick.com.
Yeah.
Big Swift swiftkick.com. How in the heck did you come up with that name?
Well, it's funny. My partner and I, business partner and I, were going through a branding exercise. It took us months to go through it. And he's a creative genius. And he goes, What if we go with Swift Kick? Played with that a little bit, and I said, no, we need to go with Big Swift Kick. And the reason is everybody's received one, everybody identifies with it, they'll remember it, and the domain name is available. So that helps. But you go, who when they were a little kid didn't receive a Big Swift Kick?
That's funny. That's funny.
And the question was, do we complete it and call it Big Swift Kick in the Ass.com?
There you go.
But we figured that would be just a little too crass. So we just said, let's just go with Big Swift Kick, and people will mentally fill in the blanks.
Yeah, that they automatically get the kick in the ass part. I think that fills in automatically. Speaking of domain names, it's hilarious. When I rebranded my company in 2006, I had to buy the domain johngrubs.com for like $700. Can you believe that?
Really?
Yeah.
Somebody grabbed it and parked it, or?
I don't know, but I had to pay $700 to get it. And it's funny, it's worth $25 now.
Wow.
I'm just joking. But I did have to buy my own domain name. So any final thoughts? So let's say that we have a $20 million business in Germany or in Taiwan, and they're just struggling to come out of this pandemic better maybe than when they went in. What advice would you give an owner like that who's struggling with business development or rethinking how they take their product or service to market?
That's a little complicated because I don't have enough information on that. My starting point is usually a discussion with them, a discovery call. And I want to know about them, their industry, where they're at, where they want to be, where the industry is going. Is it declining or is it growing? Because your strategies are different depending on growth and decline. And then I usually suggest an analysis of the sales organization so that we know what do you have to work with, because if you need a bunch of people to hunt and they don't have the hunting skills and they don't have the hunting mindset, you're going to try to teach a pig to fly and that pig's never going to fly. So, why waste your time on trying to teach them to do something that they're never going to do? That to me would say, okay, let's look at our other options to get you to where you want to be, because there's always multiple ways to get there. But you've either got to work with what you've got, or you've got to wipe them out and start from scratch. And I've never seen anybody wipe them out and start from scratch. So that's not realistic. I take that back. I did see it once, but it was just a 4-person team, and they were ready to do it. And but it's really, what do you have to work with? To me, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I said, the challenge is you've got a sumo wrestler in a marathon runner's position. Wow. And that's not going to work. So you need to repurpose the sumo wrestler for wrestling or football or something like that, and go find yourself a marathon runner.
That's something I would definitely want to see as a sumo wrestler run 26.2 miles. That would impress the heck out of me for sure.
It would not be pretty.
No. So this podcast is about going big. It's about being anti-ordinary. It's about leaving the world of average or mediocre. If there was someone out there that wanted to really go big, maybe start a new business, maybe do something that is a little bit scary, what advice would you give them?
Do it. Well, sometimes there's an advantage to being naive. Years ago, when I got ready to move to Europe and start this software company, I talked to a couple people and they all told me, don't do it. And then I asked them, did you ever start a company? And they said no. And I said, did you ever live in Europe? And they said no. And I started thinking to myself, then why am I taking advice from people who've never even tried? So then I started looking for people who started businesses and had lived in Europe. And every single one of them I talked to said, great experience, would do it again, encourage you to do it. So, don't let the people who've never done it ruin your dreams. If you're going to go big, go talk to some people who went big and take the advice from them. Don't take the advice from the folks who never took the risk or the chance.
Wow. I love that. That's so in my wheelhouse. I've got a new keynote speech that I'm delivering on Monday, and I just got booked to deliver a keynote speech in Atlanta, Georgia in September, all via Zoom. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
But one of the messages in my speech is this message about boat anchors in our lives. And the boat anchors are those people who often love us, who hold us back, and they keep us from going after something big. And they do it because they want to protect us from failure or protect us from disappointment. And I'm very passionate about understanding that there are loving boat anchors in our lives. Even when I started my company, I had a really great job in the steel industry, was making great money. Everybody in my close circle, except for my wife, she supported me, thought I was crazy for quitting that job to start this business. And it was so funny, Andy. I was one of the youngest managers. The steel mill had 2,500 employees where I worked. And I was one of the youngest managers in my early 30s, probably the youngest manager ever in that business. And I was being groomed by my boss, the VP, for his role. And I was on my lawnmower in the front yard when that moment of clarity hit me. I'm like, holy crap. If I get one more promotion, I will never leave this business. I will stay in it for the rest of my career. And I said, if I'm ever going to want to start my own thing, if I'm ever going to want to go big, this is the moment that I need to do it. It was the moment when I decided to quit. Have you had an experience like that, or know someone that's had an experience like that?
Yeah, I mean, similar. So I'm going to deviate for a second and then come back to answer your question. So the blessing that I had from my parents, and I think any parent could give their child, is giving them the belief that they could accomplish anything that they put their mind to. And whether you believe that that's true or not, okay, let's tweak it a little bit. That kids can accomplish almost anything they put their mind to, right? But it's that belief that you can do it versus you can't do it, right? It's the anchor you were talking about. So I think it's really important for parents to give kids the message that you can do anything you want if you put your mind to it and the effort behind it, and you're willing to do the work to get there. So I had that blessing from my parents, and that they gave me the belief that I could do anything. And I had a chance. So I've got an 8-page bucket list. The theme for my life is make your life an adventure. It's always been my theme. I don't know where I ever got it from, but I started my bucket list when I was a teenager, and I had a chance to hike the Continental Divide from Mexico to Canada with 3 friends. We'd planned the trip. We'd gotten sponsors. We had the gear. We'd done the practicing for the trip. But also on there, I wanted to live in Europe. And when the opportunity came up for me to buy a software company and move to Europe, that was higher on my list.
Wow.
And I sat there and said, now it's similar to you on what you're on the lawnmower, the riding tractor of, okay, this is a defining moment. Do I want to go backpack for 9 months in the Continental Divide and 4 months in snow and all that? Or do I want to take my chance, move to Europe, see what I can do with this software company? And that's what I did. Had I gone backpacking, I don't know how my life would have turned out. It definitely would have turned out very differently.
Yeah.
But I'm glad for the choice that I made. But it is that defining moment. Do I take this promotion in the steel industry, or do I go for this other thing that I've always wanted to do? Same thing. And there are those defining moments. And what I'm hoping people take away from this podcast with you and I is, when it comes down to kind of taking that chance, shed that anchor, using your metaphor, shed that anchor, take that chance. Hey, the worst case is you can always fall back and go back to the steel industry.
Yep. Beautiful, beautiful. Cut the boat anchor loose, right? Cut it loose. Yeah. And, that's my advice to people. It's better to try and fail than to have the regret that you didn't try.
Yep.
So I love that. I love that. Andy, thank you for being part of this show. One more thing I wanted to just make sure the listeners know about. Now, you offer assessments in your business to see if people are in the right positions from a sales standpoint, from a sales management standpoint. Uh, am I saying that right? That there are
That's
tools that you
correct.
have that can help people know if they have the sumo wrestler in the marathon runner's role, metaphorically or not. Is that
Yes,
correct?
exactly. And then, so we can do an assessment. We can identify where's the spot that they're going to thrive. And I'll make a distinction between thriving versus getting by. There's lots of people in lots of roles that are just kind of getting by. You and I talked earlier before the podcast began about being mediocre.
Mm,
I think getting by is being mediocre. How do you figure out where somebody's going to thrive and reposition them there so that they are thriving? And think about the advantages. To them, they're happy. They're producing more income for you. They're going to stay longer, and the prospects, clients, and employees that they interact with, it's a much more joyous interaction because they're happy.
mm.
So, why would you want to put somebody in a mediocre position? Now, one caveat to that: you're a small company, you're growing, you're going to promote somebody internally. They do okay at it. They're a good team player. Okay, and you promote them into that position. That's a stopgap measure, but don't punish them a year later when you've grown to that next spot and you're going, well, they're not doing very well in that. Well, they were your best option at the time and they took one for the team. Let's figure out where you can reposition them and have them thrive instead of going, they need to get out of here because, you know, at the time it just made sense.
I got you.
Um,
I got
so
you. I got you. So, listeners, this podcast is about going big. How do you know how big you can become unless you're willing to fail? Failure becomes the stepping stones to success in our lives. And going big, just like Andy said, moving to Europe, starting a new company, these are the people that we're appealing to with this podcast. So, Andy, thank you so much for being our guest today. We've enjoyed having you. I've certainly enjoyed your wisdom and your humor. We just so blessed to have you on our show. Thanks for being here.
thanks, John. Thanks for having me, and many blessings to you and your listeners.
Listeners, this is a podcast about going big. This is a podcast about crazy people because on this podcast, we are crazy enough to win. Until next time.